Good evening. I want to tell you a story, a horrific story about World War II and the profiteering in it, and the absolute treason that occurred on all sides to enable that profiteering. That's Eva Braun's little blue dress. When you look for Hitler, Eva Braun and the little blue dress now online, because of Greg's Hallett's exposures of that being the dress that all of our body doubles were wearing, and the ones who were found in the Berlin bunker had really flawed dentition, that's rotten teeth. She was able to flee with Hitler in what they call Operation Winnie the Pooh, and Greg Hallett typically has portrayed the whole of that story in a very explicit way. I'm going to just do a lot of reading this evening and give you some of the stories that Greg Hallett has left for us. There's images of various views of Eva Braun and how she's portrayed in popular culture. A lot of green dresses now, but very few of the images have the little blue dress. But when I exposed how they got her out through the laundering routes using the float planes and all of the story that Greg Hallett told us about the yellow submarine, and the fact that the Beatles sing about such things is also confirmation of the vicious joke that the leaders in wartime usually survive. And I'm now going to show you just some of the text from Greg Hallett, what he's done to try and sell his books. And he used to send me the stuff in emails before he was disappeared and ask me to pass it on and to publicize it, and I'm delighted to do that because it is really intensely insightful. So I'm going to shut that page down now, and I'm going to show you that Operation Winnie the Pooh deals on the 30th of April 1945. There were ample opportunities for Adolf Hitler and Eva Hitler to escape from the bunker. Let's put up some images just in case you get bored with this bit. And we can't do that, so I'll just read it to you. And so this is on my web page, and it's a page called Profiteering and Genocide, World War I and II to the present day, Operation Winnie the Pooh. For Adolf and Eva Hitler to escape from the bunker, as cover for this, no less than 6 Hitler doppelgangers were terminated around the Chancellery bunker. These were later found by the Red Army's mopping up squads. As the intelligence version of history is studied more and more, Hitler's death reveals itself as a canned meat operation. Stalin would have recognized this immediately, as he had enacted the same thing on 2nd January 1911, some 44 years earlier, during his escape out of the Sydney Street siege. Let me show you some images of that. That involved Churchill's presence. There you can see Churchill peeking round the corner at the heavily armed policemen who were about, some of them were to be shot from what is now known to be one of the training hubs near Tottenham Hotspur's football club in North London, in Sydney Street. And some of the policemen who were shot dead must have been shot dead by their own kind, and the jokes about them are the Papasokolou jokes about personal services, the movie about the madam in Wimbledon that ran a prostitution den, and a lot of the characters in that are admirals, and jokes about the fictitious characters that were actually part of Operation Winnie the Pooh, and the rabbits are Hitler and Hitler's commanders-in-chief. So there's where Stalin trained and Hitler trained at the Tavistock Institute, and there is an image of Stalin and Hitler, who was trained in Liverpool. It's ever so ironic that people can plan the brutalization of the whole world for profit, and a lot of the roles were played by people who are on different continents or have switched nations. That's Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and a picture of the Iron Cross that he won for talking up the Nazi campaigns in World War I, and he was highly decorated between World War I and World War II for keeping that Aryan mythology and all of the Aryan dream of the master race prevailing at the top of the tree. He originally, as the name would suggest, is a Brit, and at that stage Chamberlain was forced into the prime ministerial position, and Greg Hallett explains exactly how all of those little plants and quisling leaders are placed in power and how they're conditioned to sell their nations entirely for profit by the world owners. Okay, so Stalin was gifted Russia for his efforts in World War II, and there's again the Sydney siege. But let's go back to the story as told by Greg Hallett, and we can see if we can the IT is ever so difficult, but if you can go to that page that I cited first, Profiteering and Genocide, on my web page, you can then open up the small PDFs that Greg has published and read them one at a time. So both canned meat operations came with Churchill's active complicity. Many histories have exposed the burnt Hitler and Eva bodies as fake. Anomalies in the bodies prove this well enough. The dead Hitler had no gunshot wound to the skull, although it was first reported that he shot himself through the mouth. Eva was supposed to have died from poisoning, although the autopsy showed the female body in the blue dress died of shrapnel wounds, was bleeding from the breasts, and had abundant dental cavities. If this had been allowed to happen to the Führer's mistress, there would have been court-martials and trips to the wall for everyone involved. According to the spy master, who's Greg's unnamed colleague, the use of the blue dress was a case of sheep dipping. It was a key part of the cover story that Eva Braun was to be wearing a blue dress during the escape, just as the Soviet undercover told the Red Army there were also 2 skulls of Hitler, one found in the crater grave attached to the body and another presented prior to autopsy. If anything, this points to a higher level of cover-up and the possibility and probability of complicity from all sides. No war is ever finished, and each portion of unsolved war leads to the next war. Greg describes this ever so articulately. He was trained to be either the Governor General or the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and he was trained in Russia to take on those roles, but he rejected it and opted to become a historian instead. He went through terrible traumas, and his architecture degree and higher degree was stripped from him at the University of Auckland. His history is piercing. From the point of Hitler and Eva's body being brought out of the rooms, there were no positive identification. Hitler was identified from his trousers and boots, and Eva from her blue dress. In preparation for the exhausted Russians, this was a classic case of keep it simple, stupid, and in this case, the kiss of death. With 4 crew on board, as well as Adolf and Eva Hitler, Major Bernd Freytag von Loringhoven, aide to army chiefs, his aide-de-camp Rittmeister Gerhard Bolt, and Lieutenant Colonel Weiss, the submarine submerged 11:40 p.m, motored out into the current 11:55 p.m. with minimal engine power, and then cruised down the River Spree until under cover of the recently drowned hospital bodies. Flares lit their pathway from just before midnight. These are just snippets of Greg's disclosures, and the books will all be censored, burnt really soon, And the book that we're talking about here is Hitler Was a British Agent, and it exposes for the first time Operation Winnie the Pooh. Ian Fleming. Now, we've made videos on the Fleming financial frauds and the links to the Bond movies and the double agents who were desperately evil killers and were prepared to render society chaotic. And when I show you the table of contents and I read you the little PDFs for each bit, you will be horrified, and you will see that what is happening in Syria now, what is happening in Egypt, is exactly the same template, and the demonization of Islam is just like the demonization of the Jews in these earlier pogroms and the subsequent wars. The world is so chaotic, it is ever so dangerous, which is why I'm linking this to the exposures of the Trident scandal and the involvement in British leaders still in the cover-up of these massive potentially human extinction factors. Okay? The search for Hitler became an excuse for worldwide surveillance and a precursor to the Cold War. Hitler's missing year in Britain is uncovered, as is his psychological deconstruction to perform as an agent for the British war machine. It confirms his sex with men and his bizarre sexual habits with women, including hands-on murders made to look like suicides. This book covers Hess and his body doubles, simultaneous flight to Britain, the Duke of Kent's fake death, Anthony Blunt's conception by a royal, Wallis Simpson's sexual practices with King Edward VIII, and how Wallis leaked the King's British military secrets to Hitler. Hitler Was a British Agent exposes the training of top-level double agents, the repeated faking of their deaths and their very real escapes, making this something of an illusion buster. Everything that happens now happens because of 1945. Former MI6 chief, quote, "This book was written by a genius, James Bond III, a brilliant analysis of the deception of war." Not sure who those are, but they must be links to the Flemings. Two intelligence agencies have regularly stolen this book, and it has been read at the very highest levels during the final phases of writing. As quickly as it was written, it was stolen, and in August 2005 word got back that they would let it out. This came with further inside information: Hitler's British passport marked Jew, and at least one historical act. Okay, so below that on my website you'll see a list of links, and I'm just going to open them and read them out. Let's see if any of that is captured in the images that I've got for you. There is some insight from my research about the Special Operations Executive. Its allegiances were to the Western Allies, and when you begin to see the links to some of the issues that I've been describing about Miss Manning and Buller, MI5, the running of conservative healthcare companies out of Baker Street, and all of the issues that John Patterson tells you about Baker Street being used in the 7/7 London bombings to actually herd up the victims of that under Cressida Dick's thrall. Those bits I'm not so sure about, but I know that the SOE was entirely for profit. Okay, and that says to look also at the Piso Christianity fraud and the Baker Street links that are undoubtedly a joke at the world's expense because of the role of the Baker Street irregulars in wartime. And if you click on those links, you'll see something of the story about them. Well, I want to tell you about the SOE, Special Operations Executive. Its notable commanders are household names. Frank Nelson, trained at Heidelberg, one of the elite 4 universities immune from bombing for the whole of World War II. Charles Jocelyn Hambro, banking dynasty, friend of the Morgans and ever so mobile in war. Carl Joachim Hambro the Younger was a politician and civil servant in Norway and in exile during World War II in Sweden, which was totally neutral, like Spain, so it could be used as a laundering vent. Okay, Colin Gubbins, born in Japan, trained globally, in touch with people in many countries. He had helped to liberate and was invited by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, member of the 1001 Club, with the Duke of Edinburgh, to join the Bilderberg Group. Okay, see Dark Mission for land grabs and sovereignty, and to save the Tigger Nazi joke. Now the Tigger story is part of the Winnie the Pooh story. Let's see what other images we've got before I begin to read off the rather dull looking PDFs that will explain to you what Greg's writing describes. So there's the Maginot Line. The whole thing is a fraud, and what we've got is places like Brie in Belgium, where the Maginot Line was breached. That's right next door to Waterloo, and everything is a joke for them, but it is also a cull. And you can see the parallel line from Porton down right across to eastern Germany, which is the yellow brick road joke. When Dorothy emerges beyond the Berlin Wall, and some of you who are wide awake might have noticed that the Berlin Wall is not between East Germany and West Germany, it's right across next to Poland, and it is like a little archipelago and tax haven. Please have a look at the video I made the other day on David Bowie, who was resident in Berlin for some years after the war as a New World Order musician. The yellow submarine is not in that image, and there's more on the Winnie the Pooh story that we're going to see. A.A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh, and we'll get a list of characters if we scan down to the bottom of that page later on. But let me just tell you the story that Greg writes ever so well, and it is ever so shocking. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the web page, and I'm now going to just click on the links one by one and see what we've got in the contents for Hitler Was a British Agent. He wants me to publicise this. I'm still not convinced that he's still alive, but I do have director numbers for a Greg Hallett, who's in Zahawi's constituency, near the stepping stones near Stratford-on-Avon, and he's got 6 fraudulent companies, but I don't believe it's the Greg Hallett I knew and that wrote these really piercing stories. At the start of a mission, life expectancy is very low. When 6 operatives are on a mission, they tell 1 or 2 stories of what really went down. After all, there is nothing to lose. A couple of the agents die and 4 are left with 8 stories. After a decade or 2, the stories start to repeat, but those startled surprise survivors have the history of the world pierced through their thick skin and rubbed into the arms of their worn out chairs as they talk oblivious of their surroundings. They reveal their secrets and a whole new world opens up. The problem with agents is that they played a role but were denied the overall picture. Each had a piece of evidence to impart, and it's only through collecting their different stories that an entire picture emerges. When an ordinary Joe interviews more than one of them and shows their collective part in history, their friendship is immediate, protective and concerned. Their advice is always right. After all, they are the survivors of various governments' ideologies and the bizarre cravings of power. When these stories unfurl and are put in perspective, the nature of secret services opens up. With 5 decades of stories from more than one player, their stories overlap in the thousands, and a history is born. As much as I show you here, much more is left out. As soldiers, authors and historians die off, their records often go with them. Most of history is created from manufactured records, yet the true history provides us with the rich understanding of humanity's bizarre strivings for wealth and power, the destruction of each other, the desire for mass murder, and the cover-ups that follow. Heroism is wasted in war. You may win the battle, but lose the war, while treason is rewarded with entire countries and all your groceries paid for, but your life is not your own. That's the type of rewards that Stalin was given, and presumably Hitler was promised. Secret societies have long had access to the actual events in history. This is the history that the Secret Service have passed down through centuries and made available for the elite to access. This is the knowledge of power. There are 4 methods to get this knowledge of power. The first is to do exhaustive research from scratch. The second, if you can access them, is to interview the living libraries. And Greg has explained to me that often the living libraries are near death and they realise the magnitude of their sins and they want to clear up their issues because they are ever so nervous about what happens if there really is a God and they have abused the God's rules for all of their lives. Okay, so the second, if you can access them, is to interview living libraries. Old secret agents who have that smart, distrustful, questioning look in their eyes. That belies too much action and a complete surprise at being alive. The third is to be an active historian, changing history with the straw that broke the camel's back. The fourth is to belong to a secret society and you work your way up through the ranks, at which point you can't reveal the information. This makes books like this one so very rare. Okay? I have access to 3 of these methods and I can name 30 others so ordinary and bizarre as to be commonly held the work of fiction and fantasy, but they work, some only as a starting point and others as detail without the overall picture. I was asked recently, how the hell did you get past 100 security guards into President Bill Clinton's dinner speech without a ticket? Quite simply, says Greg, I used a technique so ordinary and bizarre as to be considered the work of fiction, a technique I had invented 18 hours prior. Fortune favours the brave, and history is entrusted to those who pass the integrity test for the longest. Greg was one of the most feared people on the globe because of his truths, and I'm in contention for that position now. It puts me in a very dangerous place, and thank you to everyone who's reading my articles and encouraging me to continue with it, because the spates of resignations now are coming in and the policy reversals are beginning to happen. That's all we need to get decency back in a global society. The acid test, as with history, is whatever works in inverted commas. This history does not limit itself to being from a British angle. History repeats every 60 years, plus or minus 2 years. To study the present day, the most effective starting point is to go back 60 years from the present historical figures and examine the training of their predecessors. In each war, there are double agents that go right to the top. The more effective they are, the more compromised they are, and the more they are secretly protected afterwards, right through the ages. Wars are always created through the double agents and compromised principles. Wars are always based on profit. Those who profit ignore the deaths. Those who suffer never get past the deaths. In this way it takes an unencumbered generation to illuminate the hoax of war. To create a war, you first have to invent a fictitious enemy. Can you see what is happening now with Islam in the BBC and Fox News's every breath? Even in Reporting Scotland, they are demonising innocent little towns as training people to be a menace to the world. The menace to the world are the quislings that have resigned since we began to expose them as quislings. Yeah, that's William Hague, that is Salmond, that is Johann Lamont. When I defined all those things about the profiteering and the involvement of the Labour Party members, who are no longer left-wingers, they are just fascists like the rest of the team. Okay, so to create a war, you first have to invent a fictitious enemy and then go out and kill them, without killing your own double agent. In most instances, you have to grow the double agent and the enemy yourself. This has been common practice for over a century. Stalin began his British training in 1907 and Hitler began his British training in 1912. In both cases, these double agents ended up as heads of state-running foreign countries given to them by their trainers. Stalin was from Georgia and was given Russia. Hitler was from Austria and was given Germany. To illustrate this, it is necessary to break down war into its component parts and resulting social control. Although the deaths are very real, much of war is smoke and mirrors, cover-ups and lies carried out by organised societies continuously performing magician's tricks, a succession of great switcheroos. To expose what really happened, you have to understand how these tricks were performed. Secret societies have a memory, vengeance, purpose and resources beyond generations, and this is what makes them so powerful. Those who wish to become our leaders choose the ordeal of war to prove themselves worthy of the privilege. Isn't it twisted? That's me speaking. What if we're at peace? ? There are always wars to be fought. When the British Freemasons want to create war, the American skulls prepare to supply them with munitions across the Atlantic and vice versa. When either the Freemasons or the skulls need a war for profit, they use MI6 and the CIA to create it. Other countries' intelligence agencies are also involved. They become involved based on protecting any minority sexual practices of their leaders. The divergent sexual practices of countries' leaders is the major reason for the miscalculation of war. Now, this is very important, what I'm going to tell you and what I'm telling you about the loss of my access to my own children and the homosexual relatives that are now funding my wife. It makes me ever so nervous. But listen to Greg's summary of what happens in these twisted situations. With monogamous heterosexual leaders, wars half in frequency. As a result, leaders with nothing to hide tend to be eliminated, either frustrated before they get into power or killed once in power. This is the nature of war. Deaths do not count, not even the deaths of the leaders. Straight after World War II, the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, was replaced by the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, in brackets 1946. The CIA became an ambitious, high-level, ruthless, self-sovereign organisation, effectively a marauding country on the move, a roving conqueror. The skulls drew on the CIA for their new members, the most prominent of which was George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush Sr. in 1948. That's George Herbert Poppy Bush, the joke about Poppaea in the Roman court, followed by George W. Bush in 1968, the current American president. That's the roles in the skulls and into the CIA. Both of them became American presidents. And at the time of writing, George W. Bush in 1968 was the current American president. The Skulls was founded at Yale University in 1832 for the elite children of Wall Street bankers. They were linked to the Illuminati, founded 1st of May 1776, and through them had access to the Freemasons and the Mercers, which I must confess that I know relatively little about, but I will before the end of the weekend. They take in 15 new members each year. That is stunning. I had no idea that they were linked to the elite banks in that way. America, in 2003, just prior to his inauguration as Governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger became a 16th member of the Skulls. This doesn't happen too often. America, the spiteful, youthful but vengeful bitch, did its best to profit from the managed wars of World War I, 1914 to 1918, and World War II, 1939 to 45. These were European civil wars and Masonic wars in retaliation for the American Civil War 1861 to 65 that the British had arranged some 50 years earlier, and so history is formed. The devil is in the detail, and the details are rarely revealed. So I'm going to shut that down, and I'm going to try and find some of those images of some of the key characters in the Austrian part of the spectrum. I'm not sure where that will be, but Schwarzenegger was from Austria, like Hitler, and Hitler was born in the Innsbruck region, which is the no room at the inn joke, and there are some of the characters that were involved in all of the BBC jokes. Manwaring is a magnet at the HSBC in this day and age, and no doubt his parents were also involved. Pike was the Freemason that wrote the Protocols of Zion that Hitler adhered to and began the cull of the Jews after many of the Jews, especially in those elite universities, had fled. There's the first two Jews on the Supreme Court in America for World War I. That's Samuel Untermeyer and Brandeis. I forget what his first name, Louis Brandeis. The Jewish Supreme Court. Bill Clinton, who we've already talked about, and was one of the, I think he's the half brother of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, sired by artificial insemination by Winston Churchill, and his mother, I forget what the name of the mother was. There's Woodrow Wilson with his wife, coerced into extending World War I by those two by 2 genocidal years. And when you hear Greg's descriptions of how the profiteering works, then it's ever so compelling. There's Harry Truman, who took a bung of £2 million to partition Israel and to suppress and sequester the Palestinian oil wealth offshore. Okay, and there's Clinton with Lewinsky as the press diversion, and the press headlines are that we must persecute the Germans because of the hatred that these people are sparking in mainstream America. And Wilson, like all of the other American presidents, ran on a peace ticket on behalf of the young children in America who were sent to these deaths when he was coerced in a sexual scandal. They are ever so ruthless. If the leaders will not do the indecent thing, they coerce them into it, and the whole world is run this way. Yeah, Allied and Axis countries together. What else we got? There's how the World War I went, and how much of the territory was in the hands of the Germans when they made the decision to reverse things. There is the Austrian heartland. There is the 999 zone on the top of the Alps where Hitler's nest was, and there, this little one here who looks like Ronnie Balfour Corbett, the joker in the Scottish criminal sector, who jokes at the killing of Moira Anderson and dances around with the Prime Minister in England friend Ronnie Barker, having a laugh for decades as Scottish law enforcement and the ownership of Scotland's mountains. Okay, so Schwarzenegger came from this region, and so did Hoodall. The pictures that I used to have of Hoodall's boss Pope Pius XII with the canaries on his shoulder are ever so difficult to find now. The canaries were used as laundering vents to get the Nazis out and into Latin America, and I thought I might have a picture of Eva Braun in her little blue dress, but because of the oh, there she is. That is Eva Braun in a little blue dress, but it could be green. Yeah, and there's the one that we've just seen. There's the stories about Erich Maswich penetrating the intel sector, acting like Hitler did in World War I as a spy during the war, and as a snitch to read the letters home from the participating troops. It is ever so sad. In a few years he was the head of BBC Light Entertainment, and he launched the Dalek joke, and he launched the Dr. Finley's casebook jokes about Jewish cases in medicine, and even his child programs like Andy Pandy are a joke about Teddy throwing his toys out of the cot, and Andy Pandy is in the same suit that the death camp victims are in during the war. There's Erich Maswich, and all of those are linked, like all of the rest of it, to the British monarchy, and are links to the deviants in the intel sector who now live in the tax havens and get all the British government's contracts. That's the Bransons, the Tennants, the Tweedsmuirs, and it is ever so guilt-ridden, but none of them have guilt because they're just ruthless killers. And I've explained to you Beaverbrook's emergence from Canada with a string of dead people behind him as he leaves. They don't like it to be talked about, and when I launched the little blue dress and published those stories, they were ever so keen on the cover-ups in all of the media events. Yeah, there's a reference to a chap called Brennan who wrote about the Odessa diasporas of the Nazis escaping from the Black Sea region where Odessa is, and getting into the Canaries. And let's just have a look at whether or not we can see a picture of Pope Pius with a canary on his shoulder. So let's Google images, and Eva Braun, little blue dress. There is no picture now of Eva Braun in a little blue dress, and the pictures around the bunkers are not in these set of images. The main thing though is that you realise that it is done for the power base, the carnage and the wealth divide. All of the world leaders are rich beyond wildest imagination, and what we're going to look up now was Archbishop Hoodle. And he was the son of a shoemaker. Did you know that? That's the Pinocchio joke. Everything is trivialized. All of these are genocides. But Hoodle is the son of the shoemaker. And he is the Austrian from, there he is, very like wee Ronnie Corbett, wee Ronnie Balfour Corbett. And that picture, and he went into exile in what used to be a park hotel but is now an elite mansion in Rome. Okay, that's post-war, when everybody is deemed to be innocent. Okay, and if I look up Pius XII and canary. There will be possibly no images at all. 2 days ago I got one. Can you see that they now fear the revelations of the war dead jokes like no other menace to their brutal and greedy system that has arrived before? Greg Hallett was killed because of the illegitimacy of the monarchy, or Greg Hallett was paid a fee to desist. But let's look for Pope Pius the 12th and canary, because the canaries are the main laundering vent. John Patterson told me that he has relatives on there, and right into the training period for the IRA, the canaries are at the hub of all the fraud and the friction, and the escaped gangsters from Britain that end up in Spain or Portugal have gotten there and have got vents for their frauds and their laundering in the canaries. It's historic, it's recognised, it's efficient, it's run by the CIA and MI6. Okay, so let's see whether we can get anything of Pius. And you must realise that the people who were given the tattoos under, I think it was the right ear, to recognise that they were legitimately available for laundering. Okay, there's the canary once, Pope Pius, the Nazi Pope, that's his nickname. Yeah, there's the canary in ever such a tiny form, and that's it. When I first looked for this 2 years ago, there were dozens of pictures of Pope Pius grinning like a Cheshire cat with the canary in his hands as a joke about the diaspora for the war criminals. Okay, so let's go back and read you another section of Greg's shocking truths. I'll steer clear of the sexual ones because I find them quite disgusting, and they're not nearly as important as how people get brutalized by the system. Okay, so that was the wee tab that we had open there, so let's close that to keep the computer fast enough to look at the next one. And the next one is back to that index of profiteering and genocide. There's the stories I told you about Hitler being related to the Rothschilds and Adolf Hitler in Britain. So these pages now are just samples of Greg's book, but let's read you as many of them as we can before the batteries fail. And you can go to sites google.com Professor George Lee's Revelations / Holocaust, World Wars, Cold Wars, Palestine, EU explained, profiteering, and if you hit that, you'll find it in the index down the left hand side of the page when you get into the Prof George Lee's Revelations website. Now this is greghallett.com PDF Hitler agent / Adolf Hitler.pdf. It's just a sample of Greg's work. The incestuous Catholic Jew. How incomplete, how absent, how fragmentary our knowledge of Hitler's past and what made him tick is. If you want to create a revolution, introduce new expectations and rules to live by. If you want to make a revolutionary, create someone out of their time and ensure they are disgruntled about it. This is simply done by training them in an ideology different from their time or what is currently being expressed. Many are trained and most fall away. The one who survives to lead will be a revolutionary for a variety of reasons. The harder time they have, the more changes they will make. Thank you, Borders Council. Thank you all of the people at the media events like the Southern Reporter, which is all over my Facebook page today. Thank you to the quisling leaders of the unions who are starving their members of cash and have imposed that public sector pay freeze. Yet the harder you treat the people, the more they come back at you over time. So let's repeat that again. The harder time they have, the more changes they will make. This is called creating potential in the revolutionary. Most movements created are exported overseas for subversive reasons. Movements and ideologies have become the new war. With a movement or ideology, it is possible to destroy an opposing country without firing a weapon. Political correctness is a prime example. Invented in Russia, it was exported to the West to destroy the family and fun and to stop progress. That's the Cold War. And Greg was the man that told me about the renewable oil all over the globe, and how the dinosaur bones theory is a crock of shit. The Cold War is a crock of shit. Everything is there to cover up the fact that the whole world could be prosperous and civilized, but were it not for these chaotic policies over hundreds of years. Hitler's family history is a near perfect example of how to create a criminal. Sadly, his personal history has been taken as an exemplary family pattern and is being repeated as closely as possible by nearly every government department involved with children across the Western world, and that is about sexual deviancy and upbringing and parental training. I have no access to my own children now, and my wife's brother is a poofta. Yeah, but I've taken the stage here, and Greg has told us all about the persecution of heterosexuals in family homes all across New Zealand, where I lived for 6 years, but I was too busy to notice any of that. But I've taken the stage here to outline Hitler's origins and expose his training. His initial nature was kind, caring and gentle. He was a typical beaten boy from a family that had plenty to hide. Then Catholic incest. Officially, Hitler had incestuous parents in Alois and Clara. His father's grandparents and his mother's great-grandparents were the same two people, making their marriage second and third degree incest, the wife being the niece of the husband. That's the wife 25 years old being the niece of the husband 48, who was also her uncle. This was no doubt known to Hitler and confused the family tree and the head that studied it. And there's a citation at footnote 1 there, Ron Rosebaum explaining Hitler as one of the references. Okay, that is just a one-page snippet, but it gives you insight. He understands the psychology of leadership. He understands the psychology of the family group. He understands the importance of maturity and heterosexuality to generate someone who's responsible enough to shorten wars and not to engage in them. And let's go back to the index. So Adolf Hitler in Britain, this is bullet point 3 in the table of contents for Hitler was a British agent. Adolf was christened Adolphus and called Adi by his family. I've been talking about Kate Adie, but it's spelt differently. He had been accustomed to a comparatively easy life, but when his mother died of cancer, he, age 18, took his sister Paula, 11, to Vienna, along with the most cherished possession, a photograph of Clara, his mother and second cousin. His existence had now become a pitiless struggle against poverty, and he swept streets in order to buy food for himself and his sister. From 1908 to 1921, Adolf never saw his younger sister Paula. He became an art student in Vienna, but failed miserably. And if you look on YouTube on Hitler and art, you'll find 12 very intensive videos. He became involved in architecture after the art failure. At the end of 1910 and the beginning of 1911, Hitler appears to have received a considerable sum of money from his aunt Johanna Polzl. He drifted aimlessly, yet still pretended that he was a student painter or writer. The money ran out by the time he was 19. He slept on park benches and in doorways, ate in soup kitchens, and stayed in the Asyl für Obdachlos shelter for men until 1910, where he developed an appetite for change. Formerly of the snobbish middle class, he was now a tramp. 2 years and 4 months later, on 24th May 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich. The most authoritative book on Hitler has no knowledge of Hitler's activities during the 2 years and the 4 months from January 11th to 24th May 1913. Meanwhile, Alois Hitler, 27, Adolf's half-brother, became a waiter in the Shelbourne Hotel in Dublin, where he met Bridget Elizabeth Dowling. Remember, the Irish were in league with the Axis powers in World War II, and all of the Quisling behaviours are explained in the Ryan's Daughter movie, which is a joke about the novel Madame Bovary, Madame B. Ovary, and sexual infidelity and massive genocides in double agent campaigns in war. So, Adolf's half-brother became a waiter in the Shelbourne Hotel in Dublin, where he met Bridget Elizabeth Dowling, 17, born 3rd July 1891. In the first half of 1909, her first ever date, and they eloped from Ireland to Liverpool, evading her father William Dowling. She became a Liverpudlian hairdresser, and they married and had a child, William Patrick Hitler, on 12th of March 1911. Intelligentsia in doss houses were the perfect feeding ground for the Foreign Secret Service, who are always in search of disaffected nationals prepared to destroy their own society in order to make a change. The intelligence community still meet in the boarding houses of, and because it is the sample, I cannot tell you what comes next, but it is referenced and there are footnotes on every page, and the sources are revealed if there were reliable and documentable sources. Okay, so Hitler is groomed, he's come through hard times, and the bits that I find most interesting are the bits about the programming and the conditioning. The sexuality is quite disgusting, but let's cover it briefly. Hitler's close boyhood friend from Linz, August Kubizek, wrote Adolf Hitler, mein Jugendfreund, my youth friend. Adolf did not engage in love affairs or flirtations. He always rejected the coquettish advances of girls or women. Women and girls took an interest in him, but he always evaded their endeavours. Later, August Kubitschek set up house with Hitler in Vienna, a year after he had been rejected by Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts, the Academy die Bildenden Kunst. The two used to go for long walks in the woods, and when it rained, took shelter in a shed and rolled naked in tarpaulins. Now this bit is a bit like the paedophilia. I don't know how much of this is accurate. It is bizarre. During deconstruction, it is customary that the person is sexually abused in the manner which is most embarrassing to that person. And pop singers and people throughout the free world are alleged to be deconstructed and conditioned in this way, and most of the spy community are likely to be afflicted with this. And some of the behaviours that I'm seeing, because my hometown is crawling with people that have been sent here to keep a close eye on me, and there's some of the behaviours that you see when you make a very piercing post, or you get the news out that the whole of the public sector pay freeze is due to a Quisling who's on the court of the Bank of England, and the sun comes pouring out. You get all sorts of eccentric behaviours from the people that are conditioned this way. So let me start again. During deconstruction, it is customary that the person is sexually abused in the manner which is most embarrassing to that person. In Hitler's case, he was sodomized, creating a submissive, distant respect for homosexuals like his bodyguards and some of his highest placed leaders. His natural bent was developed in coprophilia, being shat on. The colloquialism for this is scat. With each deconstruction, an embarrassing addiction is developed and filmed. With Hitler, it was sadomasochism, coprophilia and homosexuality. That is, he liked to be verbally abused and slapped around, to have his head urinated on and his chest shat on, and to have sex with men. This made him vulnerable to ridicule by his partners, and mention of it was a coded access to his subconscious, making him vulnerable to cross-purpose. The British had been deconstructing people for some time, and the Red Army began training spies using sexual deconstruction from the very beginning of the Soviet state. The very first semester started at Frunz in 1920 and ended in gangbangs every night. It was a classic British intelligence technique, but without the homosexuality. Most of the instructors were ex-British intelligence, and all of this continues into Greg's more recent books on the running of New Zealand, and a lot of it rings true about the Prime Ministers and all of the political officials like Helen Clark, who was a gangbang prostitute, worked for the KGB and was a very close friend and intel contact with President Putin from Russia. He was gifted New Zealand after the campaign. It's just sick. On 24th May 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to the bohemian gay neighbourhood of Munich. The men's shelter at MA12 House Meldemannstrasse in Munich was described by a wealthy, well-connected, and then we get the footnotes. So you're getting the picture. The books are powerful, they're insightful, and they explain things to me that have just been jargon before I read them. But I know that it happens, and I know that the patsies that come forward and claim that they killed Kennedy are conditioned to just step in front of the man with the gun, and all of a sudden you have something that covers up the death of an iconic president. I don't know whether or not he was in league. His family were bootleggers and were a little bit crooked. Joseph, his father, and that takes you back to the concept that when Joseph appears in the story, it's a new start, as if it were a biblical Messiah. Yeah, the Joseph appears in the beginning of the religious stories in most cases. And even in my lifetime, the prof that I worked with in Imperial College London, who lived overlooking Lord's cricket ground, had a goldfish called Joseph, and he believed it was the reincarnate figure of his dead dad keeping an eye on him from the tank. He took me to dine at Antoine's in New Orleans, the novel Dinner at Antoine's, I believe, and the Antoine's has been dined at by celebrities, popes, presidents, and Ron Jones, Dr. Jones, took me there to dinner at my first visit to North America. Okay, I was born for this job, and they know it because of the occult methods of predicting what is going to happen in the future. I was born to take on this cause, and I'm doing it with relish, despite the close attention of law enforcement Scotland and the desertion of almost all of my family members except my children. But when you hear what is happening when they become part of broken homes, with the influential males being homosexual with a preference like the ones that we're seeing here, it is very, very distressing. And Hallett's history of what happened to him in New Zealand is a direct parallel for that. Okay, so let's close that one and see whether we can get a little bit further down. So Hitler's psychiatric condition now, this is chapter 5 in the book. We're only getting a page at a time, but it's fascinating. And all of his books will have little stanzas like this. Everything he writes about is insightful, and everything that we published drives the media into a crazy condition, because they know the jokes already, and they're the only ones that are allowed to know them, because they have to cover everything up that might expose the fraud that is the brutalized world. So Hitler's psychiatric condition. Neurotics have the ability to harm themselves. Psychotics have the ability to harm others. Hitler did both, but as a British military agent he was trained to harm others en masse, and to harm himself with a cocktail of drugs and perverse sexuality. In 1911, the Swiss psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler invented the term schizophrenia for the condition of having a split mind. The following year, Hitler began his British military psych ops training, February to November 1912. Hitler had defensive and self-important postures because he was living a fantasy given to him by others in order to change the times. So that's why it's called the Tavistock Mind Control Institute, and they've got similar institutions in America called Brookings, and I'm led to believe that Chatham House is also works along these lines. Hitler was part neurotic, psychotic, paranoid and schizophrenic. This was the basis of his deconstruction, which although developed was always in the experimental phase. That is, it was always being tested and improved upon. This work continues in Tavistock today. It includes the deconstruction of all age groups within Britain, including preschool, school children, teenagers, young adults, working adults and the elderly. It works the media, education and politics towards a predetermined plan. In the centre is the main military deconstruction building. It is surrounded by buildings which specialise in more publicly acceptable forms of deconstruction, with names like the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. For total control over a person, the record of an embarrassing sexual history is essential. From this, neurosis, psychosis, paranoia and schizophrenia are developed and continually built upon. The avoidance of shame becomes a personal motivation. A sense of persecution and self-importance are characteristic of paranoiacs. The ability to harm oneself in summary. When the war schools look for their new protagonists, they always look for paranoiacs with a personal history of persecution and self-importance. This gives the maximum gap in the subconscious for deconstruction to take place, the gap between persecution and self-importance. So Hitler's deconstruction, chapter 6. The author may appear to be labouring points into exclusive simplicity, but such a mindset was used to develop subconscious deconstruction. The reconstruction of the subconscious, on the other hand, is based on a similar but opposing model. The first method of reconstruction, seconded from the KGB under instructions from the author, is to bypass the conscious and unconscious mind and talk directly to the subconscious by playing music at one level with the message received by sound pulse on the second level. The second method, developed by the author prior to receiving the first method, bypasses the conscious and unconscious minds and talks directly to the subconscious in its language, which happens to be something rather close to Cockney rhyming slang. The conscious mind is kept busy focusing on some part of the face, body and action thereof, while the unconscious mind focuses on the corresponding quality or attribute desired. The corresponding colloquial speech patterns are then utilised to instruct the subconscious. The conscious and unconscious minds are used as protectors for the subconscious. When they are kept busy, the message goes straight to the subconscious. Because the conscious and unconscious minds are busy in a sympathetic state, the message is immediately integrated on all levels without confusion and is three minds already. Now, the sympathetic state and the parasympathetic state are neurological terms that I'm aware of, and I'm aware of the roles for those different parts of the nervous system and the peripheral nervous system in particular. This bit I've never heard about until this week, and I'm still not convinced that it is possible, and it may not just be an entirely fictitious portrayal to keep people in fear and to rationalise what look like really bizarre human behaviours. I know that a lot of the fear mongering that put people like, who was the author of the Mars film, H.G. Wells, because of the veracity of his writing and the capacity to capture minds with fear, he was placed in the War Office. And when you get people like that able to report really scary things and technological developments, you don't really need a technological development to keep the people of the world crippled by fear. Okay? And it is ever so difficult to know what is fact and what is fiction. But Greg claimed that he was trained this way in St. Petersburg in Russia, and that the training time has come down from 9 months in Hitler's case to, I think he said, 12 hours in his day and age. And remember that this particular book was written almost 2 decades back now, I think. That's Hitler was a British agent. Okay, so let's carry on with the story, whether or not it is accurate and the science behind it. I've tried to be hypnotised to overcome my fear of needles and nails. I'm over it now, but in the early days, as soon as I saw a needle, I used to end up unconscious on the floor, but they could not hypnotise me, and I'm quite grateful for that now. The conscious and unconscious minds are used as protectors for the subconscious. When they are kept busy, the message goes straight to the subconscious, because the conscious and unconscious minds are busy in a sympathetic state. The message is immediately integrated on all levels without confusion and is three minds ready, in inverted commas. In this way, subconscious integration takes place to a predetermined goal, and all actions in the universe of that mind fall into place. The subconscious mind then acts as a Google search engine, unlimited in scope, to ensure that the predetermined goals eventuate. In this way, the most ordinary people can have a life of genius. The people that I've met in the intel sector, and some of them are very, very close to me indeed, are like geniuses. They have perfect recall. I won't go further into that, but they have perfect recall. This method was developed in Budapest, February to August 1990. After interviewing the KGB in Moscow and noticing that the population had been deconstructed, I worked on a client, and 5 minutes later they've said, "So what? Nothing's changed," and walked out with a completely different attitude. It became hard to justify the fee, so I turned to history's great unpair history. That's Greg's transition to be picked and trained for power as the Governor General or the Prime Minister, and he took on archiving the genuine world history that no one else will talk about. So, body doubles. I think we might have covered some of that in the first bit. Oh no, it's different people. Churchill invented the term Iron Curtain for Russia, received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953 for books he didn't write, and was knighted the same year. He achieved a world reputation not only as a gifted strategist and inspiring war leader, but as a great orator a talented painter and a stylish writer with a profound sense of history. Churchill, a Freemason and Druid, was also an alcoholic and a manic depressive who may or may not have achieved all of these things. From the early 1900s, Churchill drank a mixture of champagne and brandy and lounged in his bath until 2 p.m. singing Clementine, while his manservants kept the temperature just right. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my yeah, Winston Churchill made his famous speeches in the House of Commons. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat. Inaugural speech, 13th May 1940. We shall fight them on the beaches. Dunkirk, 4th June 1940. This was their finest hour. Battle of Britain, 18th June 1940. And never in the face of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. Battle of Britain, 20th August 1940. But Parliament was not wired for sound at the time, and the BBC had contracts for all but Churchill's parliamentary speeches. Straight after the 4th of June 1940, we shall fight them on the beaches speech, Churchill went to the BBC studio at Shepherd's Bush. Shepherd's Bush. Can you see the jokes? All the jokes about no room at the inn. Shepherd's Bush, the bush burning, everything is a joke at society's expense and the worshippers' expense in the religious frauds, which are massive. To deliver the same address to beam live to America and the Commonwealth. The recording equipment broke down, and when the BBC asked Churchill to make the speech for a third time, he refused, saying, I am rather busy, get an actor to do it. Norman Shelley, 1903 to 80, was a BBC Radio Children's Hour actor for the BBC radio production of Winnie the Pooh. He was also a well-known Churchill impersonator and recorded the voice of Churchill for all of the above speeches on 7th September 1942. He took his teeth out to correctly imitate Winston Churchill, something Churchill congratulated him on later. There is still some debate amongst historians as to whether Churchill or Shelley did the live speech for BBC Radio, and which of them recorded, never in the face of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. And the footnote is to one of the references, the Cambridge Biographical Encyclopedia. I'm going to run out of battery soon, but you can look it up for yourself if I don't get the time to complete this story. So that's Body Doubles, and this is the Hess story. We've mentioned the war crimes interests where body doubles, or as they call them sometimes, doppelgangers, appeared at their own trial. The authentic person appeared with the body double in the dock, being tried for the war crimes that the witnesses in the court gallery had actually committed. Hess and Hess fly to Britain, 10 to 11 May 1941. The British summoned the real Hess, the Deputy Führer from 1933, through secret channels to Scotland, and had arranged 10th May 1941 as his most portentous day. Switzerland, Portugal, British in brackets, or Spain, fascist in brackets, Scandinavia and Czechoslovakia were other possible destinations for his flight, but these were all optional decoys. At the same time, a doppelganger Hess flew to Scotland from a different location in Germany. The dates on both the real Hesses and the doppelganger Hesses' 3 weather maps illustrated these other destinations. The fact that they had 3 weather maps meant that the real Hess did not know where he was going until after he had refuelled in northern France and received additional directions. The lack of clarity was intended from the beginning so that the myth of the real Hess, 1884 to 1941, being an accidental defector or madman, could be maintained and he would never be found. The real Hess, Hitler's best friend and second in command, left Germany in secret on 10th May 1941 and landed his Messerschmitt Me 110C near Abbeville in northwest France in a makeshift airfield. The Germans had secured these airfields all over France for the Battle of Britain over 8 months earlier. These were essentially flat grassed strips with a tower holding gravity-fed fuel and a telephone. The real Hess refuelled himself and received further instructions by telephone as to his destination and departure time. He camped the night and was due to fly out the following evening, setting himself above the tail end of the Luftwaffe Blitz on London. Karl Horn was with him. The Omega files say that Hess flew to England on 10th May 1941 to stop the war with Britain and was arrested as a war criminal. However, they do not say that Hess spent a layover night in France in order to wait for cover from the Blitzkrieg. The blitzes went from September 1940 to May 1941, and Hess's cover was the last of the blitzes. 6 weeks later, Germany was focusing on Russia. Hess's body double was well trained, and this mission had been planned for a long time by both the British and the Germans. Doppelganger Hess knew all of the real Hess history and had become an expert pilot. And the body double spent his whole life in jail, and I remember the reporting of his death in the British news when I was a boy. It's just bizarre. Only humans could abuse themselves this way. Right then, Hess and Hess fly to Britain. Crashing the Duke of Kent. Now this bit I find it really difficult to remember. I can remember most of the stories that I've heard before, but this one I had to remind myself of yesterday. Flying Boat's Holy Ghost. King George VI installed his younger brother, the Duke of Kent, as Grand Master Mason in 1939, and he became the hereditary Grand Master of Anglo-American Freemasonry. The fourth son of King George V married Marina, the Princess of Greece and Denmark, 1906 to 68, and they had 2 sons. The Duke of Kent, this is really serious, and it is a sad portrayal of the monarchs for decades, centuries. The Duke of Kent was addicted to cocaine, morphine and sex, both with men and women. He didn't care which. He had a long string of affairs before marriage and continued these during his marriage, making his wife one of the most cuckolded women in history, next to the Queen. His better known female partners included Ethel Margaret Wigham, who became the Duchess of Argyll, Indira Raji, the Maharina of Kutch, Bihar, banking heiress Poppy Baring, musical star Jessie Matthews, black cabaret singer Florence Mills, and American socialite and drug addict Kiki Preston, née Alice Gwynn, with whom he had an illegitimate child. Parenthood didn't slow them down, and they had a ménage à trois with the bisexual Georges Ferrara, son of an Argentine ambassador, maybe linked to the Formula One sector loosely. The Duke of Kent also had affairs with his distant cousin Louis Ferdinand, Prince of Prussia, his half-brother Anthony Blunt, making him an incestuous homosexual, and actor Noel Coward for 19 years, explaining why so many of Coward's plays were inflicted upon us. Whoever gets to root the most royals for the longest gets the patronage. The Duke of Kent wrote love letters to Noel Coward, and these were stolen from Coward's house in 1942. He also wrote love letters to a male prostitute who responded by blackmailing him. The Duke of Kent's eldest son, Prince Edward, was the son of a cocaine and morphine addict and was born with a face like sin in a silly mirror. Lacking the required looks for royal acceptance, the family moved from London to Buckinghamshire, the no-bombing zone, that's my bit in parentheses, in 1936, to keep all male members out of the public eye. Right then.